Hey everyone, welcome back, and this is going to be the final video in the series of Spark September. We've been recording quite a lot of videos. I didn't manage to do one video every day because of things got in the way, but I think we did over 25 videos in total across the 30 days of September, which is pretty good, I think. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We started off looking at the high level, like why is Spark even useful? Why should we learn Spark? Why is Spark a part of Microsoft Fabric? Then we went into the world of the Spark data frame and we explored across about 10 videos. What can we do with Spark data frames? How can we manipulate it? Got our hands dirty with some code in pyspark. Learned a lot of different ways that we can analyze data using pyspark. Some of the other things we touched upon towards the middle of the series, the middle part of the series was machine learning. So I did a long video talking you through how to do things like feature extraction, feature engineering, training a machine learning model and evaluating that model. Then in the second half of the series, we walked through more Fabric related items. So how do we manage Spark? How do we manage Spark Compute in Microsoft Fabric? How do we customize all this stuff? How do we manage and maintain Spark clusters within Microsoft Fabric, and lots of other stuff like that as well. So in this video, what I wanted to do is just highlight some of the key kind of comments and questions that I received along this journey, because I think personally it might be very useful for other people to kind of understand the answers that I gave to some of the comments that were given to previous videos. Because if one person is not sure about something that I've said, or maybe I didn't say, but they wanted further clarification on, it's likely that other people will also probably have the same question, right? So I'm going to highlight a few questions, and then towards the back end of the video, I'm going to be signposting a couple more resources that you can use if you want to learn more about Spark, continue your Spark learning journey. So let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to start by looking at this comment here from Amrita. And this was on our video, our very early video, introducing Spark data frames, right? So I think that was day number 4. So we talked a lot about Spark, Spark data frames, Spark SQL, and a lot of the jargon can be quite confusing. I completely agree. And it has changed quite a lot as well over the last few years within the world of Spark. They've done a lot of reorganization and rebranding of lots of things. So the question here from Amrita was around clarifying what do we mean when we say SQL API and the SQL engine and the SQL component of Spark, which is completely fair because when Spark SQL is mentioned in the context of Spark, it's not actually referring to true SQL databases like relational database management systems. It's kind of just like a concept. It's just what Spark calls structured data. So columns and rows type data, as opposed to their other APIs, which are graph processing. So graph data, structured streaming, which is structured, but it's actually streaming data. So it's not batch processing as you would do in Spark SQL. The answer that I gave here was really around that Spark SQL is the generic name for the module. So when we do spark.sql, and all of our data frame stuff comes from this spark.sql part of Spark. And on top of that, you have the data frame. So the data frame is basically the main way that we interface with the Spark SQL API. And confusingly, we can write Python and Scala and R to interface with the Spark SQL module in Spark, right? So you've got to separate the Spark SQL bit, which is the core component of structured data in Spark, with the other languages like Python, Scala, R, that we can use to interface with that Spark SQL. So that's a really good question, and that's a really good question. And what I did was I linked to the relevant part of the documentation and all of my kind of answers to comments and queries. I generally like to link to relevant parts of the documentation in case people want to go and read a bit more about this. And in the documentation, it's quite well defined, the differences between Spark SQL, data frames, and also data sets, which is something that we didn't talk about much in this course. We focused on data frames. So that's a good place to go if you want to further your knowledge in the semantics and kind of what things are called in Spark and what they mean. Okay, so our second comment comes from Simon, and Simon asked about Pandas, and I think he's been playing around with Fabric notebooks and he's been writing Pandas data frames, and he wanted to know if it's better to use Spark data frames or just Pandas data frames, right? Is there any positives and negatives to both? When do you use a certain one? And I think this is a really common question, right? Because lots of people might have experience using Pandas in the Python world, doing kind of local development on their machine. It's going to be very common for people to come to Fabric with a bit of Python knowledge, but maybe not the Spark knowledge. So everything in this course that I've been developing over the last month focuses on Spark data frames. Now, I think what I mentioned in one of my earlier videos is that Spark is built for big data, okay? So Pandas is, or kind of like the core Pandas, is not really built for very large data sets. It's quite unperformant on large data sets. It's good if you're doing some analysis on your local machine, that's absolutely fine. But when you start getting into the billions of rows and gigabytes and terabytes of data, we need to completely change the way that we think about data, and we need to change the platforms on which we manage this data, because that sort of data can't fit in the memory of one computer, right? And so when we think about which one we should be using in Fabric, it's really dependent on the size of the data, I would say. So if you're just using a very small amount of data, the amount of data you can fit in a spreadsheet, for example, a few million rows, I would say you can do on what's called single node mode. So if you just do import pandas as PD and you use, for example, pd.readcsv, you're using the core pandas library there. There's no distributed data being done. You're not reading it into a Spark data frame. And so that's absolutely fine if your data is on that scale and you can do everything that you need to do in Pandas. And then maybe at the end, you can convert that Pandas data frame into a Spark data frame if you want to write it to a lakehouse table, for example. That's a completely legitimate way of working in Fabric. And it's also going to cost you a lot less, because I know if you watched the video around managing your Spark compute and setting up custom pools, I mentioned the concept of the single node mode, and that's where your maximum number of nodes will be 1. So you're not going to be you're not really going to be using Spark for the way it was intended, but that's absolutely fine. You might just want to be using Python libraries. I want to do some Pandas and I want to do some matplotlib on a single node, and that's absolutely fine. Most of the content in this course has been around Spark data frames, and that's really where we have very big data, where libraries like Pandas can't really support that. Now I have added in another point down here around the Pandas on Spark API. So there has been some development work to retrofit the syntax of Pandas to work on top of Spark and Spark data frames. And that's called the Pandas on Spark API. That might not be the official name, but it's kind of what I call it. So there is options, but you don't get the full library of Pandas that's available to you. So that's something to check out, definitely. If you want to be writing Pandas code, but on very large data sets, then maybe that's something to look at. But I would recommend that you just use Spark data frames. It would probably be a lot easier. And the syntax is quite similar, to be honest. So it's not going to be like you're learning something completely different. Okay, so we had this question here. Rowan Andrew, Michigan. Great series. Could you cover merge schema and overwrite schema? Yeah, so I did actually write a little code snippet here to demonstrate merge schema. So overwrite schema is similar, but just to show you how merge schema would work in the Fabric environment. So for those that are unfamiliar, merge schema basically allows us, as the name suggests, to merge two different schemas. And it works on Parquet files. I don't think you can do this on CSVs. Really, it's only really available to us when we have Parquet files. So The use case here would be when you have an employees table, for example, but you want to extend the schema. So maybe you want to add a new column, or you want to change something about the schema, and it evolves over time. And what's going to happen is all of your Parquet files for that existing schema are going to remain the same, but then all of your new files are going to conform to this different schema. Maybe you've added another column. So in that case, you're going to have Parquet files with two different schemas. So there is a way of reading in a set of Parquet files with different schemas into the same data frame. And so what I've demonstrated here is I've just got a very simple data set with employees data. And the schema for this one is ID, name, and salary. So ID, name, and salary. Then what I've got is another table, employee address, and that's got the schema of ID, city, and country. And so what I'm doing is creating a data frame of each of these. So we've got an employees data frame and a data frame employees add for the address. Then what I'm doing is I'm writing these files into Parquet format, because like I said, this only works on Parquet. And so this is just to like set up the example, just to make sure that we have Parquet files. Normally in your use case, you've probably already got Parquet files with different schemas that you want to merge. And then the only difference here is we're just going to call this Spark read option merge schema.true. So this is nothing different to how you would do this in Databricks or Azure Synapse. You know, nothing here is specific to Fabric. You know, it's the same piece of code that we would do in other tools. So if we run this, okay, so I've just run this code cell, and whereas before we had two schemas like this, we had the employee schema and the employee address schema. What this schema merge is going to do is merge the schemas. What it's going to do is combine these two schemas from two separate schemas into one schema and put all of the data aligned to this new schema. Again, a bit outside the scope of this course, but yeah, maybe in the future, because merging schemas and overwriting schemas and schema evolution in general is a very big topic in Spark. Managing schemas that drift over time is quite an important topic. So maybe that's something for a future video to go into a bit more detail there. So another question we had was around reading Azure SQL Server tables directly into Spark. So I am actually going to be doing more videos on migrating, getting data into Microsoft Fabric generally, OneLake generally. And so I'm not going to be answering this question here, but I will be answering it shortly on the channel. So there's another question around, and this came in the pyspark operations video. Is there a way to rename and delete multiple columns in one command? So I think this was alluding to the fact that in one of the lines of code that I had, I'd done withColumnRenamed twice to change two column names, and it doesn't look great, to be honest. I'm not sure if there is an easier way of rewriting that using withColumnRenamed, right? I think you can only do one column at a time with that specific method. There are obviously lots of ways in which we can get around this problem. So I mentioned one of them in my response. So we can treat it as a SQL command and just rename all of our columns in our SQL script. Now to do this, if you haven't already loaded your data into a file, we can do that directly using spark.sql on the source file system. Or if we've already got it into a Spark data frame, then we can save it as a temporary view and then do our SQL on top of that. There's lots of different ways. You can also use select expression, df.select expression, which another person has commented on down here. So thanks a lot for that. So yeah, there's a few different ways. Personally, I think it's cleaner just to write withColumnRenamed twice because it's readable and people will understand what's going on. If you start transforming your data set into something completely different before you pull it back in, might lose a bit of readability there. So just something to bear in mind. So I created a video called No More Nulls, how to handle missing values in Spark data frames. And we had this comment here saying, nice course. Is there a way to use a more complex imputer calculation? For example, fill null values with the mean value of each agent sales instead of the mean of the whole data set. And absolutely there's a way. There's always a way. But as far as I understand, you can't do that with out-the-box functions provided to us by the pyspark modules. Now you could very easily create that yourself. There's nothing to stop us creating our own custom imputer functions if you want to do something a bit more complex. So that's one way you could approach this, is to create your own. It wouldn't be particularly difficult. The other thing that I would mention is, obviously that's very easy to do in Pandas. So if you've used Pandas, that has that functionality out the box. So previously when I mentioned, Pandas on Spark is a thing. Well, this could be a good use case for using the Pandas on Spark API, because we can do more elaborate imputation methods in Pandas. So if we can do those on Pandas on Spark, then maybe that's a good use case for that. And I've linked to this specific method, which comes from the Pandas library, which is a group by PhilNA, which is what the commenter here, what this guy is asking for, right? Because what we want to do is group by a specific column, like the agent column, and fill values within that class, like within that category. So to create a different imputation for each category. So that's one way that we could do that. Yeah, so there's a couple of comments on the machine learning video I did. Maybe that was not the best video for beginners, completely fair. There were a couple of comments, and I asked in that video, if people wanted me to make a kind of beginner intro to machine learning, going over some of the core concepts, like the foundational concepts of machine learning. And there was some response saying, yes, that would be good. So that's something that I definitely have planned. I'm not sure when I'll get around to that, but it would be really good to do that as well. Because I think a lot of people, if you're coming from Power BI or SQL world, now you've got all of these machine learning AI tools available to you. You might want to learn how to get the most out of that, right? How do we use these things? So, but you do need a bit of basic knowledge about some of the key concepts. So that's something I might be adding in the future. What happened today, 17, 19? Yeah, sorry. I took a bit of a break for days 17 and 19. There was lots of things going on in my life, but all of the content, or nearly all of the content that we agreed on the first day in the schedule, I provided videos for. Some of them are merged into one video, right? So whereas before in the schedule, I might have split a topic into two or three videos. In the end, I merged some of them into one video. This is a good example, the customizing Fabric runtime video. So I talked a lot about custom pools, Fabric compute, Fabric runtime, all in one video, because I think it makes sense to tackle that all as one video. So I took a few days off and created one longer video. So that's what happened there. Running into a problem loading multiple CSVs into a lakehouse. Yeah, so this is not really related to the video. It's just a general question that this person had. It was around CSV files with different structures and how do we read them in when the number of columns sometimes changes. So there is a way that we can do this, and we can make use of a specific piece of functionality within Spark. It has kind of lazy loading, so it understands the structure of your files, okay? So here you've got, and then what that means is you can run SQL directly on the files. So here, what you can see is you've got, I'm not sure if you can do this on CSV actually, but you can definitely do it on Parquet files. So you can select statement in your import statement from a file, if you get what I mean. So you don't have to select star. You can do select column 1, column 3, and column 5, for example, from the file. And so what that means is if those 3 columns exist in your file, then bring them in. And then the structure of the file doesn't matter so much because you're being explicit in your select statement. So that was something to bear in mind there. And that was it. So those are all the comments that we got throughout the course. If you've got any more, of course, I'm always happy to answer any more questions. Just leave them underneath this video and I'll type out the answers to you there. There is one more thing that I wanted to point to before we wrap up. I did mention that I would give some pointers to resources that you can use to kind of continue your Fabric and Spark learning journeys. And probably the best resource that I've come across is the Fabric Espresso playlist in YouTube as well. So it's created by people in Microsoft. It's part of the Azure Synapse Analytics channel. And you get very regular content that goes into deep dives into some elements of Spark, data engineering, data science within Microsoft Fabric, right? And the good thing is that it's presented by people in Microsoft, right? So they know the tools, they probably created the tools, they know how to use them better than anyone. And so you get some really good insights about how to use these tools better. And they're quite regular, right? Yeah, so this is a book that's on Databricks, or Databricks provide it for free, basically. Learning Spark, lightning fast data analytics. And this is a really good book. And you can see it's completely free. I didn't actually know it was free. I bought this, but anyway. Or maybe it wasn't free when I bought it, but this one is a really good overview, although it's kind of presented by Databricks. The concepts of Spark is the same across any platforms, basically. And if I just show you what the overview here is. So an introduction to Spark, the downloading it. You won't have to download it because you'll have it in Fabric, assuming you're going to be using it in Fabric rather than downloading your own local version. All about Spark structured APIs. So the data frame, we talked a lot about that in our course. Spark SQL and the data frame in more detail. Spark SQL interacting with external data sets. So there's your SQL server there. Optimizing and tuning Spark applications. So some of these we talked about, but there's lots more to learn there. Structured streaming is something I didn't touch on at all in this course. That's kind of a whole nother world. But definitely going to be looking into that in more detail shortly on the channel. Building data lakes, machine learning, all this good stuff. Lots to go through there and some other stuff. So yeah, I'd really recommend this book. It's got all of the basics and more than the basics really. It's got very good coverage of basics, foundations, intermediate stuff, and also some advanced stuff as well. So would definitely recommend that. Would recommend this channel. And yeah, I'm sure there's lots of other YouTube channels as well. So, you know, if you found any resources that are useful for learning Spark yourself, then leave them in a comment and hopefully other people can get value from that as well. That's it for this series. It's been an awesome 30 days. We've covered a lot of ground. I hope you found it valuable and you've learned something new. If you did, then I'd be grateful if you can share this playlist. I'll leave a link to the playlist that you can share with anyone else, perhaps other people that are making the journey into Spark, into Fabric, that maybe haven't had exposure to it before. And yeah, hopefully you've learned something new. There'll be a lot more content coming on this channel. I'll be diving into a lot of end-to-end projects in the future. We'll be looking at SQL, as in T-SQL, not Spark SQL, transactional SQL, KQL as well. We'll be going into all of the different experiences in a lot more detail in the future. So if you're not already, then you should be subscribed. And thank you very much for watching this series, and I'll see you in the next video.